In 1943, a farmer in eastern Tennessee shot a timber rattlesnake off his porch railing with a shotgun shell packed with Rocksalt. The gun was a single-barrel 12-gauge, and it lived propped behind the wood stove in the kitchen where his wife could reach it without crossing the room. Every homestead had one, not just a gun, a whole arsenal of tools, traps, and improvised instruments, tucked behind stoves, hung above door frames, and buried in kitchen drawers. Things your grandfather never talked about because polite company did not ask. Number 9 on this list was technically illegal in 6 states by 1952. Number 3 was so effective, the U.S. Army studied it during the Frontier Wars. These are the 22 forbidden homestead weapons old farmers kept loaded behind the kitchen stove. Number 22, the cast iron skillet. Every farmhouse kitchen had one, black as coal tar, heavy as a flat iron, and seasoned with 50 years of bacon grease. A 10-inch lodge skillet weighed close to 5 pounds, enough to drop a grown man if you swung it right. Farm wives across Appalachia and the Ozarks kept one on the stovetop at all times, not just for cornbread. It was the first thing within arm's reach if something came through the back door uninvited, whether that something walked on 2 legs or 4. The skillet required no ammunition, no loading, no maintenance beyond a wipe of lard after supper. Oral histories from the Dust Bowl era record women using them against coyotes that wandered onto the porch after chickens. One account from rural Oklahoma in 1938 describes a farm wife who cracked the skull of a rabid dog with a single overhead swing before it reached her youngest son playing on the kitchen floor. The skillet was not a weapon by design, but in the hands of a woman who had cooked 3 meals a day on it for 20 years, it was the most reliable thing in the house. Number 21, the corn knife. Before mechanical harvesters rolled across the Midwest, every farmer owned a corn knife, a heavy rectangular blade about 18 inches long with a thick wooden handle built for hacking down corn stalks at the base. The blade was not sharp like a kitchen knife. It was heavy and blunt-edged, designed to chop through thick, fibrous stalks with brute force. Hung on a nail by the back door or leaned in the corner behind the stove, the corn knife doubled as the homesteader's machete. Farmers used it to clear brush, kill copperheads in the garden, and dispatch injured livestock when no gun was handy. By the 1930s, Sears Roebuck sold corn knives for 65 cents apiece, and every farm family owned at least 2. Children learned early not to touch them. The weight alone could sever a finger. Yet the corn knife was never called a weapon. It was a tool. And that distinction kept it legal, respectable, and always within reach. Number 20, the single tree club. When a single tree broke, and they broke often, the curved wooden crossbar that hitched a draft horse to a plow, a smart farmer did not throw it away. He kept the best piece, usually about 2 feet of dense hickory or oak, and leaned it against the wall by the kitchen door. It was the perfect club, naturally curved for grip, dense enough to stun a bull, and free. Single tree clubs showed up in court records across the rural South from the 1880s through the 1940s, usually in cases involving trespassers or livestock thieves caught on the property. Judges rarely convicted the farmer. A broken piece of harness equipment was not a weapon. It was just something that happened to be nearby. That legal gray area made the single tree club the homesteader's favorite piece of plausible deniability. It was firewood that had not made it to the pile yet, nothing more. Number 19, Rocksalt shotgun loads. This was the universal farmer's compromise between doing nothing and doing something permanent. A 12-gauge shell loaded with coarse rock salt instead of lead shot. It would not kill a man at 30 yards, but it would put him on the ground, screaming, picking salt crystals out of his backside for a week. Farmers loaded these themselves, prying open factory shells, dumping the shot, and replacing it with Morton's coarse salt, the same stuff they used for curing hams. The practice was widespread across the South and Midwest from the 1890s through the 1970s. Watermelon patches, apple orchards, and hen houses were the usual targets of protection. A farmer in Alabama testified in 1947 that he kept 2 rock salt shells in the left barrel and buckshot in the right. The salt was a warning. Everybody in the county knew the system. You got salted the first time. You did not get salted the second time. The gun stayed behind the kitchen stove, loaded and ready, because by the time you heard someone in the chicken coop, there was no time to go fumbling in a closet. Number 18, the hay hook. A hay hook was a simple tool, a single steel spike curved into a brutal J shape with a wooden handle designed for grabbing and dragging bales of hay. Every barn had a dozen of them hanging on nails. But the one that mattered lived on a shelf above the kitchen door or tucked behind the stovepipe. At 8 inches of hardened steel, a hay hook could puncture a tin can, drag a 100-pound bale, or convince any unwelcome visitor that the conversation was over. Farm auction catalogs from the 1920s listed hay hooks at 15 cents each. They were so common, nobody thought twice about them. Yet their shape, curved and piercing, made them one of the most intimidating objects on the homestead. A farmer did not even need to swing one. He just needed to hold it where the light caught the point. Oral accounts from Depression-era Kansas describe hay hooks kept beside beds during the worst years of drifter traffic, when hungry men walked the back roads and not all of them knocked before entering. A proper braided leather bullwhip, 8 to 12 feet long, was standard equipment on cattle ranches and mule farms from Texas to Montana. It also served double duty as a defensive tool, able to open a wound from 10 feet away without the farmer ever closing the distance. A skilled hand could crack the tip past the speed of sound, producing that signature snap that spooked predators and trespassers alike. The bullwhip hung coiled on a peg by the kitchen door in many ranch houses, not as decoration, but as the first line of negotiation before anyone reached for a firearm. Cowboys and ranch hands practiced for years to develop accuracy, and a well-placed strike could disarm a man or drive off a mountain lion. Whips required no ammunition and, if oiled properly, never wore out. A good one cost $2 in 1940, and it often lasted a lifetime. The bullwhip was technically legal everywhere, classified as livestock equipment, yet it carried a reputation that made locked doors unnecessary. Number 16, lye soap in a stocking. This one never appeared in any catalog or almanac, but it showed up in enough oral histories to confirm it was widespread. Farm wives kept a bar of homemade lye soap, hard as a brick and dense as a stone, dropped into the foot of an old wool stocking. The result was a flexible, weighted sap that could be swung with devastating force and then hung innocently on the back of the washroom door. When asked, it was just soap drying by the stove. Nothing to see. Lye soap was made from rendered fat and wood ash lye, cooked down until it set rock hard. A full bar weighed close to a pound. Wrapped in wool, it became something between a blackjack and a medieval flail. People did not talk about it, and they did not write it down. Women on isolated homesteads, miles from the nearest neighbor, knew exactly what that stocking was for. Number 15, the fireplace poker. The simplest weapon on any homestead was the one standing right next to the heat source. A wrought iron fireplace poker, 3 feet of solid metal with a hooked end, stood beside every wood stove and hearth in America from colonial times through the mid-20th century. It required no skill, no training, and no explanation. It was always hot when the fire was burning, adding a deterrent no intruder wanted to test. Court records from rural Virginia in the 1920s document at least 3 cases where farm wives used pokers to defend against home intruders, and in each case, the judge ruled justifiable defense of the home. And that invisibility was its greatest advantage. Nobody suspects the thing that has always been there. Number 14, the hog splitter. The hog splitter was the tool for butchering day, a massive blade 12 inches long and a spine thick enough to crack bone. After the autumn slaughter, the hog splitter was cleaned, oiled, mabumda and hung on the kitchen wall or stored behind the stove where the residual heat kept rust at bay. It was the heaviest blade in the house, heavier than any axe head, and balanced for downward chopping force. A hog splitter could have a 200-pound carcass in 3 swings. Farmers in the Shenandoah Valley kept them within reach year-round, not just for butchering season. The tool was essential, legal, and terrifying to look at. Its presence on the kitchen wall served as a passive security system that required no electricity, no batteries, and no conversation. Number 13, the walking stick. Not every walking stick was just a walking stick. Farmers across the Appalachian Range carved sticks from ironwood, osage, orange, and black locust, the 3 hardest native woods in North America. A proper farmer's walking stick was 3 feet of wood, dense enough to sink in water, with a knobbed head that fit the palm like a fist. Some had lead poured into a hollowed-out head for extra weight. These were carried to church, to the general store, and on every walk across the property. They killed rattlesnakes, broke ice off water troughs, and checked fence lines. But everyone understood their other purpose. An old farmer leaning on an ironwood stick by his front gate was not a helpless man. He was a man who did not need to explain himself. The stick said everything. Number 12, the black snake whip. Shorter and heavier than the bullwhip, the black snake whip was the weapon of choice for teamsters, mule skinners, and hog farmers across the American interior. 4 to 6 feet of braided rawhide, loaded with lead shot in the handle, the black snake combined the reach of a whip with the impact of a club. A swing from the handle end could knock a man unconscious. A crack from the tip could cut through denim. By the 1920s, several states began classifying loaded whips as concealed weapons when carried off the farm, making the black snake one of the first homestead tools to cross into legal gray territory. But on the property, hung behind the kitchen stove, it was just livestock equipment. The black snake never left the farm. It did not need to. Its jurisdiction was the barnyard, the kitchen porch, and every shadow between. Pattern break. Here is where things get interesting. Everything on this list so far could be explained away as a household tool. That was the whole point. Farmers did not keep arsenals. They kept kitchens, barns, and workshops full of objects that happened to serve more than one purpose. The brilliance was in the ambiguity. A corn knife was for corn. A hay hook was for hay. A walking stick was for walking. But every farmer and every farmer's wife knew the second purpose of every object in that house, and they placed them with intention. Behind the stove, because the stove was the center of the home, the warmest spot, the place where the family gathered and where anyone entering through the kitchen door would be met first. These were not accidents of storage. They were defensive positions disguised as domesticity. Number 11, the axe handle. When an axe head split or the eye cracked, the handle survived. Dense hickory, 36 inches long, slightly curved, and smooth from years of grip. Farmers kept spare axe handles the way modern households keep baseball bats. Except an axe handle was more versatile, better balanced for swinging, and completely unremarkable sitting in the corner behind the wood stove. During the labor disputes of the 1930s and the rural crime waves of the Depression, axe handles became so associated with self-defense that hardware stores in the South reportedly sold handles without heads at twice the rate of complete axes. A replacement handle cost 30 cents at the feed store in 1935. It was the cheapest, most effective defensive tool money could buy, and it looked like nothing more than a repair waiting to happen. Number 10. The ratshot derringer. Small caliber derringers loaded with ratshot, tiny pellets designed for killing rodents at close range, occupied a special place in the Homestead hierarchy. Too small to be considered a real firearm by most rural standards, a .22 caliber derringer loaded with snake shot lived in kitchen drawers, apron pockets, and behind stovepipes across the rural South and West. Farm wives carried them while collecting eggs because copperheads nested in hen boxes, and a standard bullet would destroy the coop wall. Rat shot spread in a wide pattern at close range, killing the snake without wrecking the structure. These little pistols cost as little as $3 in the 1930s. They were given as wedding presents to farm brides who would be alone on the property while their husbands worked distant fields. The derringer was not a combat weapon. It was pest control with a trigger. But it lived behind the kitchen stove because snakes do not knock. Number 9. Trapjaw snares. Before modern animal control, farmers set their own steel jaw leg hold traps around the property perimeter to catch coyotes, foxes, and feral dogs that threatened livestock. The traps themselves were brutal, spring-loaded steel jaws that snapped shut with enough force to hold a 50-pound animal. Farmers kept extra traps behind the stove to prevent rusting and to keep the springs limber in cold weather. By the 1950s, at least 6 states had begun restricting or banning steel jaw traps on humane grounds, making them some of the first homestead defense tools to face legal prohibition. Yet farmers continued using them for decades, setting them along chicken runs and lambing pens where predator losses could bankrupt a small operation. The traps cost about $1 each from the Newhouse catalog, and a farmer might own 2 dozen. They were silent, required no supervision, and worked while the family slept. Their disappearance from legal use marked the beginning of the end for an era when a farmer's property line was defended by iron and spring steel. The mattock, half axe and half pickaxe, was the heavy tool that broke new ground on the American frontier. Its broad blade could chop through roots, and its pointed end could split rock. Weighing 7 pounds of forged steel with a 3-foot handle, it was one of the heaviest hand tools on the homestead. It lived by the back door or behind the stove, ready for any job that required brute force. A mattock could dig a fence post hole, split a stump, or clear a drainage ditch. It could also stop a charging animal in its tracks with a single, well-placed swing. Pioneer diaries from the 1870s mention mattocks more frequently than rifles when describing frontier defense because a mattock never ran out of ammunition, never misfired, and could be used by anyone strong enough to lift it. Number 7. The brine-soaked hickory switch. Farmers discovered that soaking a green hickory switch in salt brine and letting it dry slowly produced a flexible rod as hard as whalebone and twice as durable. These switches were originally used for livestock management, but their sting was legendary. A brine-cured switch could raise a welt through canvas work trousers. Farmers hung them above door frames and behind stoves where the heat finished the curing process. The salt crystallized in the wood fibers, adding weight and rigidity. By the 1940s, brine switches had fallen out of favor for livestock use as rubber cattle prods became available, but many homesteads kept them for decades after. The switch cost nothing to make. Hickory grew wild across the eastern half of the country, and a farmer with a brine switch on the wall needed no further explanation of his policy toward uninvited guests. Number 6. The sausage stuffer crank. This one surprises people. The heavy cast iron crank handle from a sausage stuffer or a grain mill was a dense, L-shaped piece of iron that weighed 3 to 4 pounds and fit perfectly in one hand. Farm wives kept these in kitchen drawers after the stuffer was packed away for the season. The crank handle was compact, heavy, and unremarkable, just a piece of kitchen equipment waiting to be reattached to its machine. But swung in a short arc, it delivered the concentrated force of a blacksmith's hammer. Farm wives in isolated areas, particularly on the Great Plains, where neighbors might be 5 miles away, kept these tools handy, not out of paranoia, but out of the plain mathematics of distance and response time. Help was not coming quickly. The crank handle was what you had right now. 3 feet of heavy iron chain pulled from a well mechanism and coiled behind the wood stove was one of the most devastating close-quarters implements on the homestead. Well chain links were forged thick to bear the weight of full water buckets, and a length of chain swung in an arc, generating momentum that no solid object could match. Farmers kept spare chain for repairs, and the coil behind the stove stayed dry, rust-free, and warm. Chain was unglamorous, noisy, and terrifying. The sound of it uncoiling off a stone floor was enough to make anyone reconsider a plan. Historical accounts from the Missouri and Kansas border during the 1860s describe chain as the preferred defensive tool in households where firearms had been confiscated during wartime occupation. It could not be banned, confiscated, or identified as a weapon. It was just chain. Number 4. The tobacco knife. In the tobacco-growing regions of Kentucky, Virginia, and the Carolinas, every farm owned a tobacco knife, a short, heavy blade with a curved tip designed for cutting tobacco stalks at the base. The blade was about 10 inches long, thick-spined, and sharp enough to slice through a 2-inch stalk in one stroke. After harvest season, the tobacco knife was cleaned and stored behind the kitchen stove, where the warmth kept the blade dry. It was the perfect defensive tool for close quarters. Short enough to use indoors, heavy enough to chop through bone, and so common in tobacco country that no one gave it a second glance. A tobacco knife cost 50 cents and lasted a generation. In the hands of a man who had spent 30 autumns cutting stalks from dawn to dark, it moved with a speed and precision that no outsider wanted to test. Number 3. The hot water kettle. Every kitchen stove in America kept a cast iron kettle of water heating on it at all times. Hot water was essential for washing, cooking, cleaning wounds, and scalding poultry. Military historians studying frontier defense have noted that boiling water was the most common defensive weapon used by women on isolated homesteads from the 1830s to the 1890s. It required no strength, no training, and no courage beyond the act of lifting and throwing. A gallon of boiling water caused immediate incapacitation at close range. Frontier journals and Army correspondents from the period document multiple instances of farm wives using the kettle to defend against home invasions when their husbands were away. The kettle was never classified as a weapon. It was never restricted, debated, or even discussed. It simply sat on the stove, doing exactly what a kettle does until the moment it was needed for something else entirely. Number 2, the skinning knife. Every homestead had a skinning knife, a short, curved blade designed for separating hide from carcass with surgical precision. Unlike kitchen knives, the skinning knife was designed to cut only skin deep, never penetrating into the meat beneath. The blade was kept razor sharp, honed on a leather strop hung beside the stove. Farmers used it for everything from dressing deer to opening feed sacks, but its placement behind the stove was deliberate. The skinning knife was the tool a farmer's wife could grab without looking, muscle memory guiding her hand to the handle as naturally as reaching for a wooden spoon. It cost a quarter from a Sears catalog in 1925. It was light enough for a child to hold and sharp enough to cut leather. And it lived its entire life in the kitchen, unremarkable, essential, and ready. Number 1, the stove lid lifter. At the top of this list sits the humblest object of all, a coiled iron handle about a foot long with a hook on the end designed to lift the round cast iron plates off a wood stove so you could feed the fire. Every wood stove came with one. Every farm wife used one 50 times a day. And every one of them knew something that nobody ever said out loud. A stove lid lifter, heated by hours of contact with a working stove, was a branding iron without the brand. It was always in her hand. It was always hot. It never looked like anything other than what it was, a simple kitchen tool doing its simple kitchen job. But a farm wife standing at her stove with a lid lifter in her grip was not a woman to be trifled with. She did not need to threaten. She did not need to explain. The hook glowed faintly in the dim kitchen light, and that was enough. Court records from rural America contain almost no references to the stove lid lifter. That is because its authority was never challenged. It lived at the intersection of domesticity and defense, the place where a woman's daily work became her daily armor. And it sat on the stove in plain sight from the day the homestead was built to the day the last fire went cold. Here is the truth nobody talks about when they romanticize the old homestead. Those farmhouses were not just homes, they were positions. Every object had a purpose, and most objects had two. The stove was not just for cooking. It was the command center of the house, the warmest spot, the place where tools stayed dry and hands stayed close. Our great-grandmothers did not live in fear. They lived in readiness. There is a difference. They placed their tools with the same care they placed their furniture, knowing that the nearest sheriff might be an hour away on a good road. And every one of these 22 items was legal, common, and invisible, hiding in plain sight behind the kitchen stove where the heat kept the iron warm and the wood dry. Share this with someone who remembers. Better yet, tell me in the comments which one your grandmother kept behind her stove. I guarantee she had at least 3 things on this list, and she never called any of them weapons. She called them tools. That was the genius of it.